Imagine living in a cell the size of a bathroom, alone for 23 hours a day, where silence isn't peace, it's punishment. Where your mind becomes your only companion, and your worst enemy. Welcome to ADX Florence, America's most secure prison. But behind the concrete and steel lies something even darker, the unseen war inside the human mind. Before we begin, if you're drawn to stories that reveal the hidden realities of America's prison system, from the walls of ADX Florence to the minds of those trapped within, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell. We uncover the truth others won't, and trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. Because what you're about to hear isn't just about walls and guards. It's about minds unraveling in silence. This is Unseen Minds, ADX Florence's psychological isolation. Deep in the arid desert of Colorado, surrounded by miles of nothing but rock, barbed wire, and razor-edge silence, stands a place designed to contain the most dangerous men alive, or so the government says. ADX Florence, known officially as the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, was built to be the clean version of hell. When it opened in 1994, it was supposed to be the answer to chaos, a response to violent incidents inside federal prisons where guards were killed and riots erupted. Here no one could escape. No one could even touch another person. But what the designers didn't anticipate was that while the body could be contained, the mind could not. Inside ADX, inmates live alone in small concrete cells, 7 by 12 feet, with solid steel doors that close them off from the world. There are no bars, only gray slabs and reinforced walls. Their windows are 4 inches wide, angled toward the sky, so they can't even see the mountains surrounding them. Everything is controlled. The lights, the food slot, the air, the sound. Some inmates describe it as living in your own tomb. For 23 hours a day they are locked inside. The 24th hour, if granted, is spent in a small enclosed yard called the cage. It's a space slightly larger than the cell, covered with steel mesh instead of open sky. You can walk a few steps, maybe look up to catch a sliver of sunlight, but even that is rationed. Psychologists who've studied ADX describe it as an experiment in total control. But experiments have consequences, and this one tested the limits of human sanity. Over the years, reports began surfacing, stories that defied belief. Men talking to themselves for hours. Screams echoing through the corridors at night. Inmates mutilating themselves just to feel something. Others, quietly ending their own lives. A former warden once said, "It's not built for rehabilitation. It's built for punishment." The Justice Department itself called ADX a facility for the worst of the worst. But among those held here were not just terrorists or cartel leaders, but inmates whose only crime after conviction was losing control inside their own mind. The question began to surface: how far can the human mind go before it breaks? And at ADX, that question wasn't philosophical. It was survival. By the late 2000s, even the courts began to take notice. In 2012, a lawsuit, Baycode versus Federal Bureau of Prisons, accused ADX of inhuman treatment, particularly toward prisoners with mental illnesses. The claims were disturbing: inmates banging their heads against the walls, smearing blood on the floor, and hearing voices that never stopped. Some guards admitted that mental illness was common, but mental health care was almost non-existent. The American Civil Liberties Union and several advocacy groups called ADX a psychological death trap. Yet even as these stories reached headlines, federal officials maintained that ADX Florence was essential, a necessary evil to keep the rest of the system safe. But safety for whom? The outside world, or the inmates trapped in their own minds? Because behind those walls, silence doesn't bring peace. It breeds madness. And that's exactly what we're about to explore. Night inside ADX Florence is unlike anywhere else on Earth. It's not the kind of darkness that brings calm, it's the kind that presses against you. The hum of the fluorescent light fades, replaced by a suffocating silence so deep that inmates say they can hear their own heartbeat echo off the walls. But sometimes the silence breaks. A sudden scream cuts through the corridor. Then another. And before long, the screams overlap, different voices from different cells, until the sound becomes a haunting chorus of human suffering. One former inmate, Jack Powers, who spent more than a decade at ADX, described it this way in a court affidavit. The screams never stop. You hear men crying, talking to themselves, banging on the walls, all day and all night. It's like being trapped inside a living nightmare. Powers wasn't exaggerating. He was one of several prisoners who later became part of a landmark lawsuit alleging that prolonged isolation at ADX drove inmates to madness. Psychologists who reviewed their cases found symptoms of what they called SHU syndrome, named after the special housing unit, where inmates are held in solitary. Symptoms included anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations, and uncontrollable rage. In simple terms, the brain begins to eat itself. Humans are social by design. The mind needs stimulation, conversation, light, variation, even conflict. But when those are taken away, the brain begins to deteriorate. Neural pathways that handle memory and emotional control start to degrade. Even time itself becomes distorted. Days blur into weeks. Weeks melt into months. And the only markers of time are mealtimes and medication rounds. Some inmates develop rituals to survive, counting cracks in the wall, pacing back and forth for hours, talking to insects, reciting the same phrase 1,000 times a day. Others simply stop talking altogether. In 2015, the New York Times gained rare access to interviews and documents about life inside ADX. One inmate had scratched words into the concrete wall of his cell. "I am the ghost of myself." He hadn't spoken to another human being face-to-face in years. Psychiatrists who studied these effects found something chilling. Prolonged isolation doesn't just cause mental illness, it can permanently alter the brain's structure. MRI scans showed shrinkage in the hippocampus, the part of the brain that controls learning and memory. Cortisol levels, the stress hormone, spiked abnormally high, day after day. The body lived in a state of constant emergency, as if it were trapped in fight-or-flight mode forever. Former ADX psychologist Craig Haney once testified before Congress, saying, "The psychological damage is not hypothetical. It's real, measurable, and in many cases irreversible." But perhaps the most haunting stories come not from scientists, but from the inmates themselves. In 2011, reports surfaced of a prisoner named Jose Vega, who began mutilating himself repeatedly while in solitary confinement. He cut his wrists, bit off his own fingertips, and told staff he was trying to silence the voices. Another inmate, known only by his initials MR, begged for mental health treatment but was ignored until he attempted suicide, twice. And then there was Thomas Silverstein, a name that became synonymous with isolation. After killing a correctional officer in 1983, he was kept in solitary confinement for over 36 years, longer than anyone else in U.S. history. He later described his time as being buried alive. "I was in a world of my own. The only thing alive in there was my imagination." Even wardens admitted that Silverstein's confinement was beyond human endurance. But at ADX, endurance is the point. The Federal Bureau of Prisons argued that these men were too dangerous to mix with others. They said isolation wasn't torture, it was protection. Yet psychologists warned that even those who weren't mentally ill when they arrived, often became so after years inside. One researcher, Dr. Terry Kupers, compared ADX to a psychological experiment without consent. If you wanted to design a place to drive people insane, you'd build something exactly like ADX. And perhaps the most unsettling truth, even the guards began to change. Former staff reported that the endless monotony, the constant watchfulness, and the atmosphere of dread affected them too. Some developed insomnia. Others reported panic attacks and paranoia. A few said they would hear echoes of inmate voices, even after leaving the prison grounds. The madness of ADX didn't stop at the steel doors. It seeped into everyone who entered. And yet, despite decades of warnings, lawsuits, and psychological studies, the system remained defended as necessary. But behind that word lies a haunting question. If a system breaks the minds of those it confines, who truly becomes the monster? In the beginning, ADX Florence wasn't presented to the public as a place of psychological warfare. It was marketed as a marvel of control, the ultimate solution to prison violence, escapes, and chaos. The blueprint was drawn with precision. Every angle of sight, every airflow, every possible sound had a purpose. And the purpose was isolation. But what no one publicly admitted was that ADX soon became more than a prison. It became a living laboratory, a real-time study of what happens when the human mind is deprived of every social and sensory connection. Inside, cameras track every movement. Microphones capture every word, every cry, every silence. Every door that opens, every flush of a toilet, every meal slot that slides open. All logged, monitored, analyzed. The prisoners, often without realizing it, became part of a massive, ongoing psychological observation. Officials justified it as safety monitoring. But for psychologists who later studied the data, it painted a chilling picture of human behavior under extreme confinement. A prison engineered for control. ADX was designed in layers. From the moment an inmate arrives, he enters a process meant to strip away not just freedom but identity. His name is replaced with a number. His possessions, gone. His voice recorded. His movements reduced to routines. The architecture itself is a psychological weapon. Every hallway is silent and sterile, no color, no warmth. Cells are angled so prisoners can't see each other, only blank walls or the faint reflection of their own silhouette in the steel door. There are no communal areas, no cafeteria, no chapel. Even exercise is solitary, a small box of concrete with no view of the horizon. Inmates describe it as existing in a world without edges. Nothing to focus on. Nothing to hold on to. Just endless sameness, day after day, year after year. Psychological experts call this sensory deprivation. It doesn't just affect emotions, it rewires perception. Inmates lose their sense of space and time. The brain, deprived of input, begins to generate its own hallucinations, voices, even tactile sensations that feel real. The quiet observers. Behind the mirrored glass and the security feeds, psychologists and wardens track behavioral patterns. They note which inmates pace, which talk to themselves, which remain completely still. Medical files grow thicker each year, filled with reports of behavioral deterioration, psychotic episodes, and self-injury. Yet, most inmates never see a real psychiatrist. Mental health check-ins often happen through the steel door with a staff member shouting, "You okay in there?" In the lawsuit Baycode v. Federal Bureau of Prisons 2012, attorneys revealed that some inmates were medicated without full evaluation, sometimes just to quiet them down. Others were punished for self-harm, written up for destroying government property. It was in many ways a paradox. The prison designed to control behavior was creating the very chaos it sought to prevent. The human experiments. Several former inmates later said they felt like lab rats. They spoke of guards deliberately testing reactions, depriving light for days, turning it on at random hours, or refusing to answer when called. One man claimed his meals were delivered at unpredictable times, sometimes within hours, sometimes skipped entirely. Though the Bureau of Prisons denies any such intentional experiments, patterns and multiple testimonies suggest otherwise. Dr. Craig Haney, who has studied solitary confinement for decades, called ADX the most extreme social experiment in modern corrections. His research showed that prisoners' emotional stability plummeted after just 6 months, and within 3 years, nearly 50% displayed symptoms of severe psychological impairment. One report from 2014 described inmates who refused to leave their cells even when given the chance, saying they had forgotten how to interact with others. Their world had shrunk to a 7 by 12-foot box, and anything beyond it felt alien. From prison to prototype. What's more disturbing, ADX Florence didn't remain unique. Its model spread. Dozens of states began constructing mini ADX units, known as control units or supermax wings. They borrowed the same design, same isolation model, same routines, all inspired by the success of Florence. By 2010, more than 80,000 prisoners across the United States were in some form of solitary confinement. The psychological experiment had gone nationwide. Critics began to ask, if these conditions destroy the mind, why replicate them? The answer, according to internal memos and government reports, was efficiency. Solitary confinement required fewer staff. No fights, no riots, no contact. It was expensive, but predictable. The cost wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in broken minds. The ethical dilemma. Even some correctional officers began to question the morality of what they witnessed. One former guard, speaking anonymously to the Marshall Project, said, "We weren't just guarding prisoners, we were watching them fall apart, piece by piece." Another recalled an inmate who spent so long in silence that when he finally spoke, his voice cracked like someone learning to talk again. The American Psychiatric Association eventually condemned long-term solitary confinement as a form of psychological torture. But inside ADX, change was slow, and for many far too late. ADX Florence was built to control behavior through architecture. But what it truly revealed was this. You can lock away a man's body, but if you trap his mind long enough, the walls start to live inside him. For most of the world, ADX Florence is a fortress shrouded in silence. But behind those reinforced concrete walls lie the stories of men who walked inhuman and left as ghosts of themselves. Stories that reveal not just the brutality of confinement, but the fragility of the mind when stripped of human contact. Each cell, each number, each name, holds a psychological case study in what it means to endure the impossible. These are the men who broke inside ADX Florence. Jack Powers, the mind that imploded. Jack Powers was once a bank robber, not a killer, not a terrorist. But after a violent altercation inside another federal prison, he was sent to ADX Florence for security reasons. What began as a short-term placement stretched into over 12 years in solitary confinement. Inside that box, Powers began to unravel. He reported hallucinations, hearing his mother's voice whispering through the air vent, seeing shadows move across the walls. He mutilated himself repeatedly, cutting deep wounds into his arms and legs just to feel alive. When attorneys later met him through the thick glass partition, they described a man whose eyes looked like they'd seen hell. In one letter to his lawyers, Powers wrote, "The walls move. I talk to people who aren't there. I dream while I'm awake. I'm losing pieces of myself every day." He filed complaints begging for psychiatric help. Most were ignored. By the time the case Baycoat versus Federal Bureau of Prisons reached court, Powers had become a symbol of ADX's psychological cost. When the settlement came in 2016, it included reforms, but the scars on Powers' mind were permanent. He once said, "They took my body and put it in a box. But it's my mind they buried." Jose Vega, the man who couldn't stop bleeding. Then there was Jose Vega, a prisoner with documented schizophrenia. Transferred to ADX despite his condition, he spent most of his time talking to voices no one else could hear. Guards said he would whisper to the walls, then suddenly scream in terror. One day Vega began cutting himself with shards of plastic, over and over. When questioned, he said he was trying to drain the poison. In reality, he was trying to silence hallucinations that told him he was being poisoned through his food. Medical staff treated the wounds but left him in the same isolation unit. Within months he was dead. His death barely made headlines. But among human rights lawyers, it became another example of what psychologist Stuart Gracian called the solitary mind's collapse. Thomas Silverstein, the ghost of ADX. No name is more synonymous with isolation than Thomas Silverstein. Once a leader of the Aryan Brotherhood prison gang, Silverstein was convicted of murdering a federal guard in 1983. From that moment on, the Bureau of Prisons declared him the most dangerous man in America. He was held in total isolation for 36 years, longer than any prisoner in modern U.S. history. His world was a single cell, a small recreation pen, and no direct human contact, not even with guards. Letters were censored. Conversations were monitored. His only companions were his thoughts. In one of his rare writings, Silverstein described his cell as a cement tomb. He said, "It's like being buried alive and left to rot. You forget what people look like. You forget what you sound like. You start to wonder if you're even real anymore." By the time he died in 2019, Silverstein's story had become a chilling case study in prolonged isolation. Even some prison officials admitted that his confinement raised moral and constitutional questions about what punishment should mean. The unnamed, the forgotten minds. But beyond the infamous names, there are hundreds of others. Men whose stories were never told, whose suffering never made the news. A mentally ill inmate who clawed at his own flesh until he needed stitches. Another who smashed his head into the wall until he fractured his skull, and was written up for destruction of property. A third who tried to kill himself by swallowing pieces of metal, 3 separate times. Their names are redacted in court records, replaced with letters and numbers. Their existence known only through paperwork marked confidential. Psychiatrists who reviewed those files say it's evidence of systemic neglect, a culture where mental breakdowns were seen as behavioral problems, not medical crises. In 2012, the American Journal of Public Health published findings from former ADX medical staff who admitted that psychological care was superficial and inconsistent. One former psychologist confessed anonymously, "We were treating broken minds with silence and sedation. That's not therapy, that's surrender." The breaking point. For many inside ADX, the true punishment wasn't the sentence, it was the waiting. The endless, timeless cycle of solitude that stripped away hope until nothing remained but routine. Some inmates would beg to be transferred to lower security prisons, even if it meant living among violent offenders again. They wanted noise, conversation, anything to remind them they were still human. Others, broken beyond repair, refused to leave their cells even when offered. After years in isolation, the outside world had become terrifying. One guard described it best. "It's like training a man to live in a coffin, then suddenly telling him to walk into the sunlight." ADX Florence had achieved what it set out to do: eliminate danger, control behavior, prevent riots. But in doing so, it created something far darker. A silent epidemic of psychological decay, one inmate at a time. And still, the system continued. Because in the eyes of the law, these men were the worst of the worst. But behind every number was a human mind, one that could only bend so far before it shattered completely. Most stories about ADX Florence focus on the prisoners, their isolation, their madness, their screams echoing through the halls. But there's another side to this fortress of silence, one that rarely makes headlines. The men and women who work there. The guards, psychologists, and administrators whose daily job is to walk those same concrete corridors and keep order in a place built on human despair. What few realize is that the isolation seeps into them too. ADX doesn't just confine the inmates, it transforms the people who guard them. A job few can handle. To work at ADX Florence is to enter a psychological pressure cooker. Every guard passes through multiple checkpoints before reaching their assigned unit, surrendering phones, radios, and every sense of normality. The air feels heavy, the silence unnatural. Correctional officers describe a constant awareness that every step, every move, every word is being monitored. No one trusts anyone completely. Even among staff, small talk fades over time. One former officer who spoke anonymously to the Marshall Project said, "You learn to be quiet. You stop smiling. You stop feeling. Because if you do this long enough, empathy becomes dangerous." The Bureau of Prisons requires staff to undergo psychological screening before assignment to ADX, but even with training, many don't last long. Turnover is high. PTSD rates among ADX officers are among the highest in the federal system, according to internal reports obtained by journalists in 2018. Some guards describe the same symptoms as the prisoners: insomnia, anxiety, emotional numbness. The environment that drives inmates to madness also erodes the sanity of those sworn to keep them contained. The night watchers. Inside the control unit, guards monitor inmates through reinforced glass and camera feeds that never stop. They watch men sleep, pace, scream, self-harm. They record every incident, every breakdown. One veteran officer told a reporter, "You start to recognize the sound of each man's madness. The one who sings all night. The one who whispers. The one who laughs at nothing." He paused before adding, "After a while, you start hearing them when you go home." Guards rotate shifts to avoid burnout, but burnout is inevitable. Some cope with dark humor, others withdraw completely. A few develop an unhealthy fascination with the inmates they watch. A former psychologist at ADX recounted that one officer confessed, "I stare at these guys for 12 hours a day. I know their routines better than I know my own kids." Over time, empathy turns to fatigue, then to detachment. It's a survival mechanism for both sides of the door. Psychologists in a paradox. The mental health professionals at ADX face an impossible challenge: treating psychological illness inside a structure that creates it. Sessions often take place through thick glass, or over an intercom system. Inmates rarely make eye contact. Some refuse to speak at all. One psychologist described her experience to The Guardian. "You're treating trauma you can't stop. You're giving therapy to people you know will go right back into the same conditions that caused their illness." Many psychologists burn out after a year or two. Those who stay develop what they call emotional calluses, a detachment that lets them function in a place where suffering never ends. Dr. Craig Haney, who interviewed staff as part of his research, said, "The institution breaks down not just prisoners, but the moral framework of everyone who works there. When the walls talk back, guards report hearing things that aren't there: phantom footsteps, voices in the intercom, the sound of doors slamming when no one's near. Most chalk it up to exhaustion or the strange acoustics of the concrete hallways. But after years of service, some admit they can't tell what's real anymore." A retired officer once said in a documentary, "ADX gets inside you. Even when you leave, it doesn't leave you. You start seeing walls everywhere, invisible ones." Others develop what psychologists call institutional drift. They lose interest in the outside world, feel uneasy in crowds, or prefer silence to conversation. They become, in a way, like the men they guarded, solitary, withdrawn, hyper-aware. One guard described his transition after retirement. "When I got home, I couldn't sleep without hearing the buzz of the doors. My wife would talk to me, but I'd catch myself waiting for an intercom beep before answering." The moral weight. For some staff, the emotional toll isn't just from the isolation, it's from what they witness. They see self-harm, psychotic breaks, and suicides. They carry the burden of enforcing a system that punishes beyond the physical. A correctional counselor once said, "We're told we're protecting the country. But some days it feels like we're watching people disintegrate." Even high-ranking officials have questioned the ethics of the institution. Former Warden Robert Hood, who once ran ADX, publicly called it a clean version of hell. He admitted that while the facility achieved control, it did so at a moral cost. You can control a body. You can silence a voice. But when you start breaking souls, that's when you have to ask what kind of system you're part of. The shared cage. In the end, the line between inmate and staff blurs. Both are trapped inside the same fortress of silence, one by law, the other by duty. One loses his mind slowly in solitude, the other loses it by witnessing solitude day after day. ADX Florence doesn't just house broken men. It creates them on both sides of the bars. In the heart of Colorado's desert, ADX Florence stands motionless, its razor wire glinting under a cold sun, its walls hiding stories too heavy for daylight. From the outside it looks like control. But step closer and you realize, it's something else entirely. It's the sound of minds breaking quietly. Of guards who can't sleep. Of men who can't remember what a voice sounds like. It's the price of punishment when punishment crosses into something darker. The world calls it the clean version of hell. But the truth is, there's nothing clean about it. The screams, the silence, the forgotten, all mixed together into a question that America still refuses to answer. How much of a man can you destroy before you've gone too far? As one former ADX inmate once wrote on a scrap of paper smuggled through the mail, the walls don't just hold you. They hold your mind. And perhaps, in the end, that's the most haunting part of all. That the human mind, the most powerful thing we have, can be broken not by violence, but by silence. If this story opened your eyes to what really happens behind the concrete walls of America's most secretive prisons, don't forget to subscribe for more documentaries that expose truth, not fiction. Your support helps bring light to places built for darkness. Because as long as silence rules these walls, someone has to keep telling their stories.